Today's training is specifically for private schools as recipients of federal funds. We have a current grant opportunity that allows private schools to be eligible recipients. So this is likely new for many of you who are attending and serve at private schools. But this presentation will focus solely on information and considerations you may need to make as a private school, considering whether or not to apply for a federal grant. A lot of material to cover, but again, we'll go through some of the initial slides in norms and reminders to kind of get us set and started. Before I do that, would like the two gentlemen I mentioned to briefly introduce themselves, Cory and Damon. Whoever would like to go first, if you can say hello and introduce yourself.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Damon Hoyle. I am the grant program contact for the School Health Support Grant. And so just excited to be here with you all, supporting my colleagues. And yeah, so good morning.
Thanks for joining us, Damon. Good morning, Cory.
I'm Cory Green. I'm the Associate Commissioner and Chief Grants Officer at TEA. Just want to kind of reiterate a little bit what Matt was talking about. We have an opportunity for private schools to receive direct grants from the agency with federal grant funds. This opportunity does not happen very often for private schools. And so we just want to really reiterate and make you aware of all the federal rules that you would be signing on to if you choose to apply for the grant. It's not to scare you away from the grant. The grant can provide some great services to your school, but it's just so you are aware what all is involved with accepting a federal grant through the agency, which comes out of a federal agency such as DISH's and CDC. Thanks.
Great, thank you for joining us, Cory. And my name is Matt Lashley. I'm Chief of Staff, Department of Grant Compliance and Administration. Fortunate enough to work with both of these gentlemen, and I think some of you who are joining us who are actually from schools and other LEAs, just for more information. So we will go ahead and get started. A common slide, I won't read it, but want to reiterate a disclaimer on our training presentations. This is intended solely to provide general information and guidance to the participants of the training, in this case, predominantly private schools. This information is always subject to change. One of the things we will learn is that guidance and regulation can change at the federal level from time to time. So this presentation is not legal advice. You will always be advised to seek legal counsel regarding this information and guidance provided in this presentation. This is a similar disclaimer we provide to school districts. It's just important to know. We often recommend legal advice for specific questions. So that should hopefully kind of point to the fact that we will be answering general questions through the Q&A, but always recommend that. These materials are as up to date as we can have them at the time, including the PDF I have put in the chat. We've tried to hyperlink it, so there may be little inconsistencies and things we try to fix before we repost. So we always reserve the right to update and revise before we resend, always trying to continuously improve our resources. So we'll take another check-in on this after the presentation before we repost, but the guide in the chat should help you if you want to follow along in the slides. If you joined and don't see the PDF in the chat, we'll have to repost it in a little bit. We posted it after the start time of 9 o'clock. And reminder, this will be recorded. So here's our agenda for the day. Couple of acronyms that may be new to some of you, maybe not new to others. And we will jump right into the norms and reminders. Please use the Q&A feature in Zoom for questions. We're only able to monitor chat very little during this presentation. Questions on the content in the presentation really need to go in the Q&A feature. When you do that, there is also a feature to going to pull it up where we can allow, hopefully you're seeing that, allow you to upvote. So you don't have to retype questions if you see them and it's a question you want answered. You can go to that question and hit the thumbs up and vote it. Vote it up. We're going to take questions from the top by those most asked. So as we go through this information, encourage you to ask questions at any time, but be mindful you may be asking questions we cover, and you can also vote up the Q&A. think Damon's going to try to answer some as we go along, but we typically try to answer these verbally as we get through the presentation to try to give better coverage of Q&A at the end. We address as many questions as we can. Again, we have till about 10:30. We will try to answer any questions in our FAQs if we have them, or revise them in our presentation materials. We will and almost always post recordings of any of our webinars and presentation slides. I think in this case, we'll try to post all of this by 5 o'clock tomorrow, specifically for those looking at the health support grant, but we post everything to our TEA YouTube page and channel, so we'll have it in a few places for you. Slides will also be shared, have already been shared in the chat, and we'll send them out to anyone that registered. We already have your email address. Even if you can't hear me because you chose not to attend, you will get an email with all of these slides. Everything will be given to you after this presentation. This slide deck is chock full of hyperlinks. So anything that's underlined that is differently colored is likely a link to a resource to a lot of federal guidance or other resources. So try to make this a good reference material as well as a slide deck for you. So keep it, use those URLs and links as you explore some of this information. One thing I want to point out that's probably one of the most important things to remember if much of this presentation is pretty weighty and heavy, is to please sign up for our agency wide update page. So there's a direct link there on the current slide. We use a system called GovDelivery, and you simply put in your email address, and then when you go to that and you choose to sign up, you will have a list of many topics. Two that I recommend you hit the checkbox and join. There is a specific listserv for private nonprofit schools that we've been building. You can join that listserv, and we send out any information specific to private schools to that listserv. It's the best way to get information. This training was actually sent out through there. That maybe how many of you found out about it. And then there is also a grants listserv that will often have a lot of information that is only applicable to LEAs or school districts and open enrollment charter schools, but it is an open subscription list. So if you're not opposed to receiving more emails than you may need, you want to go to that link, and I recommend you sign up for both of those listservs. We push out a lot of information there. So that's probably the number one takeaway. That's also where we will send out links to recordings and session materials for those that weren't able to join as well. So we're going to get right into it. The background and hierarchy of grant requirements. Many may think, and many may have experienced something like this. There are a lot of rules and requirements with federal grants. That is correct. The hierarchy of grant requirements is layered. So we're going to start with a few definitions you'll see throughout the presentation, and then we will kind of unpack some of these and talk about some of these definitions and acronyms to try to help you get a better understanding of the implications of being a recipient of federal funds. So a couple of general terms that you will see is a pass-through entity is really any non-federal entity that provides a subword. So in general terms, a good example is TEA would be a pass-through entity. A grantee, we use this a little more generally, but really is any organization that is a recipient of a grant. So you can be a pass-through entity and be called a grantee. It doesn't always include secondary recipients such as subgrantees, but that term gets used sometimes a little bit loosely, but we've tried to cite in some federal code that we will look at a little bit later where these definitions come from. Non-federal entity is you, me, and anybody else that's not part of a federal agency. It's state, local government, Indian tribes, institutions of higher ed, nonprofit organizations. So non-federal entity for the purposes of this presentation would refer to a private school that is a recipient of federal funds. And then subgrantee is defined by TEA to be the same as a subrecipient. Again, it's one of those non-federal entities that receives a subaward from a pass-through. So the hierarchy here would be TEA as a pass-through and grantee, though that term grantee gets used sometimes incorrectly, but TEA as a pass-through entity or grantee to a subgrantee, which may be a private school or other school. In the example of something like the health support grant, Texas DSHS, we refer to as DISHES, would really be the pass-through entity. So we are a sub-grantee. So many layers there in receiving federal funds and some background definitions. Generally, I will refer to NOGAs, which is a notice of grant award. In many cases, it looks like a certificate. It is that all-important piece of paper that confirms award of federal funds to a grantee or sub-grantee. We typically use the term NOGA, but it could also be referred to as a grant award notification in some circles. Two other definitions I mostly wanted to cite, and we'll go into a little bit of detail on in the next slide, is FASRAC, the Financial Accountability System Resource Guide. This is deeper in the weeds accounting information that is hosted on the TEA site and is defined in Texas Administrative Code. So you want to get used to seeing those links again. We'll typically go to state and federal rules and regulations. UGG is Uniform Grant Guidance. It encompasses Code of Federal Regulations and establishes requirements that apply to all federal grants and is incorporated into Edgar. So I'll already hit you with a whole bunch of acronyms. Again, you can use the Q&A. We will answer some of these throughout the presentation and they're linked through the slide, but don't want you to get too overwhelmed by this alphabet soup. We will talk about many, if not all of these terms. More of these federal acronyms and definitions are available for, at least from the federal side right there at that link, the 2 CFR 200. So it has some pretty good definitions at the federal level and talks about many more acronyms that federal agencies use. Hierarchy of grant requirements is a pretty telling slide that will kind of show you where we derive requirements of grants all the way down to a notice of grant award to a school, like a private school. Precedence always lies with the U.S. Constitution. And then we will go kind of scaffold down to authorizing statutes. And a good example here of an authorizing statute would be the American Rescue Plan Act that would authorize programs under that statute. So for for all TEA grants, there will be, in the guidelines or other documents we talk about, there will be identification of an authorizing statute, which is just under the Constitution. Then we have federal regulations. This can be where it gets a little bit confusing, but we'll talk about the Uniform Grant Guidance and Edgar. A big difference here to note is you're going to see federal regulations that seem repetitive or duplicative, or that we reference them with several names, but Uniform Grant Guidance would be to any grantee recipient of federal assistance. Edgar, which we'll talk about in a bit, is specific to Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education. We then go down to the state level with some other items we won't go into heavy detail on, but we have the soon-to-be retired Uniform Grant Management Standards that will be replaced by the Texas Grant Management Standards housed by the State Comptroller. Those are underlined because they are hyperlinked for you, and then there is also a link to FASRAC. So this is the addition of state regulations to grant requirements. Federal agencies often do also issue non-regulatory guidance. That's kind of how it is tagged, non-regulatory guidance, and it is, as the title suggests, it does not carry the weight of other regulations, and as you'll notice, is actually under state regulations, but oftentimes we will receive non-regulatory guidance. This can be seen in things like frequently asked question or guidance documents issued by federal agencies, or in guidance or presentations similar to the one we're providing now. But again, it is non-regulatory guidance. Following that, there are requirements and a request for applications. This is a kind of broader area that includes everything from program guidelines and an application to the timeline for a grant. So when we refer to a request for applications, if we use the health and support grant as an example, the request for applications would include the program guidelines, that will be talked about at a future presentation, the application, and all of the incorporated regulations, assurances, and provisions. So it kind of packages everything that's a part of a grant program. And following a request for application, if you're a recipient of federal funds, you receive a notice of grant award, or NOGA, which again incorporates everything you see in the slide above it, but also may include some additional requirements in that grant award. That is a broad picture of where we get our grant requirements. I wish it were that easy as one pyramid. We're going to go into detail in each of these, but I wanted to pause there and see if our TEA Chief Grants Officers with us, Cory, had anything you wanted to add about this, Cory, or any additional guides before we move forward.
Nothing yet. It looks like a lot, and it is, but we're going to work through all of it for you. So we'll have a lot more questions at the end.
So I'm going, sorry, little click happy there on the scroll. We'll first go to Edgar. We talk about Edgar a lot. Edgar starts to seem like a person, but it is actually not. Edgar is the Education Department General Administrative Regulation. So this word can be a little bit confusing, but you'll notice in the presentation we try to tie these together. Edgar is a compilation of administrative requirements for grants for the U.S. Department of Education. So again, by this being a compilation, you're going to see that Edgar includes a lot of the Code of Federal Regulations. These are items we're going to talk about later in the presentation. So it's not a wholly new or different set of requirements. It's a compilation of existing requirements that is directly applicable to the United States Department of Education, which at TEA is by and large our largest federal funder. Again, in the case of something like the support grant, the health support grant for schools, it has many differences because it actually comes from federal, another federal agency in the CDC. So when we often get this question from schools, does Edgar apply? Because it's a compilation of so many federal regulations, the short answer is if you are a school and a federal recipient of federal funds, yes, Edgar applies. There can be differences going back to that pyramid, whether it's non-regulatory guidance or what's in the grant award, or what comes from the federal agency as far as additional requirements. But we often get this question, does Edgar apply? Yes, it does. Again, it is a compilation of federal regulations, some general to any recipients or subrecipients of grants, and some more specific, and that may be a little bit different under Department of Education rules, regs, and guidance. Edgar governs all federal grants awarded by USDE. So even though the grant we referenced is not USDE, much of Edgar will apply for schools as recipients. Just a quick kind of read on what Edgar covers. We'll get into detail here, but covers things like how schools or subrecipients track and report time and effort, how they manage indirect costs, timely obligation of funds and carryover, financial management rules, program income, record retention. Quite a laundry list there, and we will go into specific detail and have these resources hyperlinked. But you can see it's a pretty encompassing set of administrative regulations. Edgar emphasizes, and you'll hopefully hear this throughout the presentation, emphasizes internal controls and documentation, and this is all to strengthen oversight of federal funds. The main goal here with all of these programs that offer federal assistance is to reduce risk of fraud, waste, and abuse. So one of the goals here is that you really hear our emphasis today on internal controls and documentation. Is really probably the #1 best practice for a federal recipient that that we consistently train and provide guidance on internal controls and documentation. Part of the Edgar as a compilation is what we refer to as the Code of Federal Regulations, or the CFR. So this will be the the largest portion of our slides today, and this will get it can get pretty deep in the details, but we wanted to give you something that points to every piece of the Code of Federal Regulations you'll want to consider and think about when you are determining if you're going to apply for a grant and become a recipient of federal funds. So the CFR, again, is a codification of general and permanent rules published by the Federal Register. This is divided into over 50 titles. And so we have two links here. The second point there, we have the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations is continuously updated online. ECFR is not an official legal edition, but it's an unofficial editorial compilation. So if you went to the first link in the full CFR, there would be many things that are not current. It is more in line with being a PDF or published document, whereas the ECFR, which is what we're going to use today, while it's technically not an official legal edition, is more up to date and will be our primary resource that the slides link to. So throughout, we will use the ECFR to kind of point to the information we are covering. Most of what you see in the CFR that we're going to cover relates to Title II. Again, 50 titles. We will be focused primarily today on Title II, but you will also see sometimes references to Title 34 in cases related to education. And then this is just a general statement that is really at the heart of why we're sharing this information today. By accepting federal assistance, whether it's through a grant, a cooperative agreement, or other financial assistance, private schools will be considered non-federal entities, going back to that definition we shared earlier, and are thus subject to all applicable requirements, citing those sections at the start of CFR 200. So these requirements include, but are not necessarily limited to, federal rules on the following. So this is where we will start to get into a list of many of the pieces of CFR Code of Federal Regulations that you would be assuming responsibility for as a federal recipient. So a few of these slides will be overwhelming, trying to put some information and kind of front load it for you, but I want to point out we will go into more than a handful of these requirements. This is not necessarily built to be too eye appealing, but these slides are built so that you can use them as a reference later. So in each of these requirements, we have a link as direct as we can make it to the ECFR for that citation, so that you can go straight to it. In most cases, it'll go right to the section as close as we can pin it. And then we'll try to be a little more summary in the notes here for each of these requirements. And hopefully these will lead to some questions and some discussion. But one of the broader requirements that you assume responsibility for is for financial management. This is pretty broad, but a couple of points here. I'm not going to read each of these. That generally, you're expected as a federal recipient to expend and account for awards in accordance with state laws and procedures, going back to that pyramid that includes state regulations. This includes accurate identification of federal awards through account listings and numbers. There are often a lot of identifying numbers like the CFDA, pass-through ID numbers, NOGA ID numbers. There are a lot of identifying numbers, but we start with something like the CFDA for domestic assistance. In general, numbers you will see in program guidelines that will be reviewed specific to each grant. So these are identifying pieces for grant funds. These are pretty general points, but again, it points to responsibility to keep and maintain accurate, current, and complete financial records and documentation. Again, internal controls and documentation. And again, for a federal subrecipient to have records that identify the source and application of funds. So the general picture here is really solid documentation and internal controls showing, identifying and showing federal funds received, and then how those funds are applied or used. And this is where you'll see again that the real emphasis on control over and accountability for all funds, property, and other assets. So this is a high level of responsibility for our current grantees at school districts and LEAs, and would be one that you would assume responsibility for as a recipient of federal funds. A couple of other points there that relate to financial management. The last 2 points really point to written procedures to implement requirements and for determining allowability. So the best point to share here, but is also kind of resonates throughout requirements, is there is a very important and high threshold set for written policies and procedures at your local school or institution. And that's where we come to our next requirement, internal controls, 2 CFR 200-303, linked there at the top. There has to be an establishment and maintenance of effective internal control over federal funds. You can start to see here where we derive that upside down pyramid we talked about, where compliance has to be with the US Constitution, federal statutes and regs, and in terms of the federal award. And there's a requirement to evaluate and monitor compliance of your internal control over federal funds, and an expectation that a recipient of federal funds would take action when identifying areas of noncompliance, whether they're self-discovered or brought about through audit findings, and then to take reasonable measures to safeguard sensitive and personally identifiable information. So a lot of this in internal controls is borne out through things like monitoring and compliance of grants, audits, and audit findings. These internal controls are often, if not regularly, reviewed for grantees, depending on how often they're monitored or reviewed by the federal or state levels. TEA has federal fiscal monitoring teams for our grants as well, for different monitoring units, and internal controls and documentation are almost always at the heart of what these compliance and monitoring professionals are looking for. So two pretty heavy requirements there. I urge you to continue to read and review at the links provided there. We go into a little bit further detail here for other requirements to consider, but cash management and federal payment, a couple of things to point out here. The main takeaway here is that at the federal level, payments must always minimize time lapsing between transfer of funds from Treasury and disbursement by non-federal entity. Grant funds are either paid in advance or by reimbursement, sometimes by reimbursement if there are specific requirements. There will be some additional information about dispersing of funds from program income, rebates, and refunds and other issues related to cash management and payment. And then there is some guidance here about ability to restrict or withhold payment. So it's a pretty high bar that payments to recipients of federal funds cannot necessarily be withheld without cause. So there often has to be proof that there's failure to comply with project objectives, statutes, regulations, or terms and conditions, or some delinquency in some other federal debt. So the takeaway here is as a recipient, your grant funds won't be put on hold, or are not allowed to be put on hold unless they meet one of those requirements at the federal level. There are there's additional information about the types of banking and financial institution standards in this regulation, and then some stipulations on return of funds. At TEA, we actually have for grants a full cash management and expenditure reporting team that works with all of our recipients and has state level rules, regulations, guidance, and procedures as well that we will point to later in the presentation. Another area is inventory management for equipment and supplies. So this is probably going to be one of the bigger differences you will notice as a private school if you're considering being a recipient of federal funds versus experience you may have had as a private nonprofit school participating and receiving equitable services. But inventory management is a different approach when you're a federal and different rules when you're a federal recipient. Title to the equipment vests in the non-federal entity for authorized purposes and not to encumber without approval. So as a federal recipient, the title, for lack of a better term, then transfers to the non-federal entity. So basically becomes title and all interested become a part of that recipient, in this case, a school. So a difference here with some of our programs where there's private, nonprofit, equitable services. In these cases, as a federal recipient, these materials, these supplies, this equipment fall under different rules where they're not necessarily given back to a school district or an ESC. So they weren't just provided for use during the term. As a federal recipient, the title vests with the non-federal entity. Some specifics here on equipment and supplies. They're to be used under the program they were acquired under as long as they're needed, regardless of the funding. So if the equipment or supplies were purchased through federal funds and are still needed, even if the award ends, they're still to be used for those program purposes. After project end, equipment may be used in activities under other federal awards from same agency or another agency in that order. So the equipment can be used to meet other needs in other areas. The equipment and supplies can also be available for use by other federal projects or programs, even when the project has not ended. So a good example here is equipment that may be purchased for I'm going to use communities and schools after school program. Could be used, if it's an after school program, could be used to meet the needs of other recipients that are part of other federal programs during the school day. So the equipment doesn't necessarily sit there unused if it needs to be made available. But again, the primary purpose would be for the grant under which it was provided. There are also some caveats here that that a federal subrecipient cannot use equipment or supplies to provide services for a fee less than a private company equivalent. So if there's a fee attached to a use of equipment or supplies that were provided through a federal grant, and generally, as an example, $10 an hour, I'm making up some numbers, $10 an hour for use of a rent space is generally the going rate in that locale or area. You couldn't rent space for $1 to another program. It needs to be in line with kind of what's prevailing at a private company or other entity. And then there's some additional language in those CFRs 313 to 314 about replacement of equipment and offset of cost if equipment needs to be replaced. A little bit further into supplies here. Again, documentation. Management must include property records, physical inventory, and control systems. So you can imagine as a federal recipient, a lot of documentation and control systems for physical inventory and documentation of procedures to do that. One key thing I want to highlight here is there is a full federal and a TEA process for disposition of equipment when it's no longer needed. So we don't say disposition here, meaning dispose of, meaning everything is thrown out. Dispose in this case means what is done with this equipment or supply when no longer needed. So we have some specific resources at the TEA level and procedures for inventory disposition that are readily available any day throughout the year for a grantee that's going to dispose of. But generally there's a $5,000 threshold or less where equipment can be retained, sold, or otherwise disposed of. And then for equipment over $5,000, it can be retained or sold. And there's a percentage of proceeds that would go that would stay with the grantee. There's also an opportunity to transfer title to an eligible third party, but I want to point out that at the end of a program, there is an inventory disposition process. So it says when approved by awarding agency. In this case, any grants under TEA would have to disposing of any inventory would have to be approved by TEA, and we have some links later on to share that. Generally, the guidance here for supplies is pretty similar, and you'll see a couple of points there, but again, high threshold of responsibility here to maintain property records, inventory, and have a control system for maintenance and procedures in place. One of our largest topics, often most questions are asked about this, even for our longtime grantees, is about procurement. So this will be, I will pretty heavily summarize here because we have some more state level resources and information, and we'll have subsequent trainings. But for procurement, the standard here is to have and use documented procedures consistent with state, local, and tribal laws. So in the case of a school that's a recipient, generally without having and following documented procedures that take into account federal, state, local laws, a recipient of federal funds is not able to just go out and purchase whatever is needed as needed. There are thresholds for procurement, and there are many regulations and processes that need to be followed. A key takeaway here for procurement for any recipient of federal funds is you follow your most restrictive policy. So a good example could be that there's a dollar amount threshold by which you would have to go out and get a bid. And let's pretend that the federal government sets a threshold of 10,000. If you have a policy at your school, at your private school, and you're a recipient of federal funds that says you bid for anything at 5,000 or above, you would follow the most restrictive. So a school can actually have a policy that makes this requirement more restrictive, which is completely their choice, but we go by most restrictive. So that's why many questions we get about procurement from schools or recipients of federal funds are, which do I follow? And it's always going to be your most restrictive policy. This regulation includes a lot of oversight to ensure performance and goes pretty heavily into conflicts of interest, which is another area we at TEA have forms and processes to cover. And then in latter pieces of the requirement talks about ways to ensure economic efficiencies in vendors and providers. But this really leans towards full and open competition when procuring goods and services. And then spells out a couple of procurement methods that we also have guidance on at TEA. Informal methods like micro and small purchase, and then more formal processes like sealed bids and proposals. I will say that if you go to this link in this regulation, you will see more general language, but we do have Procurement Guidance Handbook at TEA I will share a little bit later, and other more specific language that is shared throughout the TEA website and resources. So this gets procurement can be a pretty overwhelming topic, but generally we have more comprehensive resources at the state level that we will share. Again, at federal level, there's a real focus on use of small, minority, and women's businesses and labor surplus area firms. And then a couple of other items, domestic preference, use of recovered materials, cost, contract cost and price, and federal and pass-through review. Generally, in this regulation, as in many others, local policy and procedure needs to address these requirements, and you would need internal controls showing how they are maintained or enforced. So much of the work in this area of procurement, if you speak to any of your colleagues at public school LEAs or others, is really about reviewing, updating, revising, and analyzing their local policies and procedures to ensure compliance with federal. So again, it's really in the local policies and procedures and the internal controls and documentation. A couple of other areas to point out. Reporting is actually not too large of a section here, but you'll see this more specifically when you get to actual grant RFAs and requirements if you apply for a grant, but there is a requirement for financial reporting, program performance, and reporting on real property. As a recipient of a TEA grant, you would generally see reporting requirements followed by TEA as a pass-through entity, and then, for lack of a better term, distilled into a set of program guidelines. So when you go to the school health and support grant and go to those guidelines, you will see assurances and requirements throughout. If you're joining that presentation later today at 11 for that specific grant, you would see reporting requirements. Those requirements are part of how we meet this federal requirement, and also, again, ensure financial compliance, program performance. Again, all part of a larger effort to reduce fraud, waste, and abuse, and achieve the intended outcomes for the students these grants should be serving. But again, many of these requirements, just like that pyramid at the beginning, you'll see really general guidance at these CFRs, and you'll see as we get down to state level all the way down to a notice of grant award where these requirements are built in throughout an application. Record retention gets a little more specific here, but there are requirements around record retention. And again, we're going most restrictive. So really that last bullet is the key takeaway that state of Texas requires 7 years of record retention or 5 years from the closeout of the grant. So again, in as much as it is important to maintain documentation, the maintenance threshold here is 7 years or 5 years from the closeout of a grant. So once a grant is done, for reasons that will kind of become more apparent if you become a recipient of federal funds, maintaining all of these records much after the close of the grant is required. And then closeout, something adding here, closeout. This is something that's recently changed at the federal level, and our longtime school district and LEA and open enrollment charter school recipients of federal funds are now falling under this requirement as well. But a subrecipient, so in this example, if you were a private school, you would be required to submit to a pass-through entity, TEA in this example, within 90 calendar days after the end of a project, all financial performance and other reports as required by the terms and conditions of the federal award. So this is kind of a hotly debated and questioned issue in some grants. A good example here is if a federal agency gives a grant to TEA and it ends, let's pretend it ends 30th of September, 2021. A subrecipient by federal law, we cannot give that same end date to a recipient because we are required to give 90 days to a subrecipient for closeout and reporting. So you'll see in some grants, and you'll say, why is this grant so short? Why does it close before the funds expire? This is not this is not a choice by TEA. This is not a requirement. We try to trying to make things more difficult, but we actually have to provide 90 calendar days. We actually get a few more days than that total, but we give 2/3, if not more of that time to all of our grant recipients to ensure financial compliance. If we don't have good closeout of a grant, it can open you up to audit findings and potential refund of federal funds. So this is a big reason why grants don't always go another 2 or 3 months to the actual end. We can't close them out on the very last day of the federal award. And that relates to a lot of the requirements we've already covered as far as financial management and internal controls. Some of the more lengthy citations and requirements that I really do encourage you to read at the links provided, and we'll talk a little bit more about, is allowability. A general phrase I think you probably hear even more than fraud, waste, and abuse would be necessary, reasonable, and allocable. So the test for allowability of an activity and use of federal funds for that activity is it necessary, reasonable, and allocable? Is it necessary to achieve the goals of the project? Is it reasonable? And is it allocable to that specific project? We'll talk a little bit more about these. These are 3 kind of determinations people often ask, well, how much is enough, or what is necessary, and what is reasonable? I think oftentimes we refer to this as what would be reasonable to a prudent person. We will cover these details in many of our other training series, but is the cost necessary, reasonable, and allocable? Kind of a 3-part test that is talked about. And if you go back to those earlier definitions in the presentation and the CFR links, you'll see some more discussion about necessary, reasonable, and allocable. Some concepts we'll unpack in subsequent trainings. The allowability, this must conform to any limitations or exclusions within allowable uses of funds. Consistency with policies and procedures. So allowability is not something that can be, you can pick and choose. It's consistent treatment of allowability in that consistent 3-part test. We talk about consistent treatment of costs for direct or indirect costs, administrative costs here. So a very kind of crude example is if in one grant you have costs for someone doing one specific activity and you charge it directly to the grant, and then receive a subsequent grant, you cannot then charge that same amount differently than you would have in the other grant. So the policies, the procedures, all lead to a consistent treatment of your costs. Not able to quickly pivot and change how funds are budgeted. They have to be done consistently. Again, also following generally accepted accounting principles, or what we call GAAP. A couple of other points here for allowability. You can't use federal funds to be counted as to be included as a cost or used to meet cost sharing for other federally financed programs. So can't use federal funds to be cost share for other federal funds. If there's a requirement of cost sharing, whether it's in kind or cash, it has to come from other non-federal sources. Here's always the kicker: adequate documentation. How much is adequate? Again, hopefully you're hearing that documentation and internal controls are very important. So much of the work of our colleagues at our current grantee schools and LEAs is developing and producing adequate documentation for audits and preparing for that. So adequate documentation would show necessary, reasonable, and locable. And it's not really an easy litmus test because there can be different determinations depending on an audit or monitoring or review. But I just can't emphasize enough how important documentation is when you're a recipient of federal funds. And even though we're on allowability, this goes all the way back to our initial requirements of financial management and internal controls. Allowability also has to show that costs were incurred during the approved budget period. So this sounds maybe quite simple. It's got to be in that grant period, but a good point to raise here is earlier we talked about inventory disposition. We know there are instances where equipment supplies or other things may be used after a grant period, but the costs must be incurred during that budget period. So not necessarily reasonable, it could, I'm going to say necessary twice, or may not be as necessary or reasonable to make a purchase in the last month of a grant if the benefit of that is not going to be realized in the life of a grant. So this kind of relates to things like stockpiling. It would not be compliant to operate a technology grant where you purchased iPads for students and it was a one-year grant ending at the end of December, and you purchased all the iPads right up until the end of December to use them for the next year. It has to be, the benefit has to be realized during the approved budget period and incurred at that time. And there are many more specific pieces of guidance related to that. So getting into a little bit of the discussion of reasonable and allocability. So reasonableness, here's that statement about a prudent person. A cost is reasonable if in its nature and amount it does not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person under circumstances prevailing at the time. So this is a determination threshold. You'll notice there's not a marker set on an amount that's reasonable given every instance. But there are specific considerations of reasonableness at 2 CFR 204 at the link that you would want to review. Allocability just needs to show that the goods and services are chargeable or assignable to that award so that they've been allocated to that award. It's got to be incurred specifically for that award. Benefits the federal award and other work can be distributed in proportion as necessary for the overall operation. So you can't purchase or procure any good or service with one grant if it's not being allocated to that grant specifically. Indirect costs. Couple things I want to point out here. TEA has a full team that handles indirect costs. Generally, without going into too much detail, indirect costs, there are two types of percentages of indirect costs that are issued to federal recipients. For a first-time recipient of federal funds at TEA, there is a process to get an indirect cost rate issued. We again have the federal guidance here, but indirect costs, because of diverse characteristics and a lot of accounting practices, indirect costs are used when it's not possible to specify certain types of facilities and administrative costs. So indirect costs can be, you can kind of think of this as costs that you might apply to any federal grant for the accounting and general administrative tasks, but again, has to be treated consistently. And our TA resources have a direct page for our indirect cost team. The largest section of CFR are selected items of cost. So this one I really would go into directly to the link. Encourage you to do that at 420 to 476. This section outlines many items and covers allowability at the federal level. So if you see this last bullet, some of the examples of specific items that are covered is allowability of advertising, alcohol, payroll, all the way down to lobbying, pre-award. A really good section for folks to look at if you're unfamiliar with allowability that talks about selected items of cost at the federal level. Keeping in mind that pyramid, just because all these things are allowable at this regulation does not mean the subsequent grant program will allow everything as well. You could have a grant that does not allow equipment. Statute or state regulation or some other state requirement could take a training grant, for instance, and not allow purchase of equipment. That restriction could be made, again, lower down that pyramid we looked at, even though it's allowable generally at the federal level, may not be allowable as other requirements are considered. And then annual audit rules. This is a full subpart. I won't go into too much detail, but this is a regulation or requirement that is applicable if an entity, in this case, a private school, if if you're a federal recipient and expend more than $750,000 aggregate in federal funds in a year, would be required to have an annual audit. And again, many more things that we can go into full detail on. We're approaching the hour, but those CFRs are linked. And this is meant to kind of be a reference material as well as a slide deck for you. A little while ago, Damon reposted the PDF for the slides. So just want to encourage you to go there if that is needed as well. Not seeing any questions in the Q&A. Again, please feel free to add questions. We will get to them shortly, but you do not need to wait to type those in if you have questions. Grant requirements from awarding agency. So again, if we look at the pyramid, we've gone down from Constitution all the way down to a federal agency now. So in this case, from the awarding agency, we talk about a federal agency. So a good example in this case would be CDC at the federal level, or this could be USDE for other grants would be the requirements from that agency. Each federal agency can impose limited additional grant requirements. So they can't require anything and everything under the sun. There are certain things they can and cannot do, hence things like non-regulatory guidance. There are limitations to requirements even at the federal agencies, but there are some things that can be imposed. Each awarding agency, then you get down to an agency like TEA, can also impose some limited additional grant requirements. So if you go back to that, I almost wish I had it here, but I won't click back to it. That pyramid, this is where we get to the state requirements, and then we get to the request for applications and the state regulations, application, and other items. So in these examples, some really good ones are state travel rules and state procurement rules. Texas has, in these cases, specific travel and procurement rules that may be more restrictive than the federal agency rules. Fingerprinting and background checks are a good example as well. When you apply for a grant, these requirements are all embedded in the guidelines and the application, and these are all things you certify and assure to follow when you apply for a grant. So it's referenced throughout, but the state rules come into play. So if you become really good at the federal, you could know the stuff kind of top to bottom, but you could be missing requirements at the state level that become more restrictive with travel or procurement. A lot of things in procurement that are different at the state level. So these are all kind of pointing to having policy and procedure, and that statement I made earlier about following the most restrictive. And also need to kind of become more familiar, if you're going to become a recipient of federal funds, to become more familiar with the resources and information around potentially more restrictive state grant requirements. We are going to go into guidelines, provisions, and assurances. This probably sounds like a pretty general header, but this is actually going to point to specific compilation of a lot of the things we've talked about. And one of the things I'm very grateful for at TEA is that our grantees have a one-stop shop for these assurances when they apply for grants. So it may be hard to find when you first look at grants, but I want to point to some of this in the next slides. Two links that are very important there to bookmark if you're considering applying for funds. For all grants administered by TEA, TEA publish general fiscal and program specific guidelines. So guidelines, provisions, and assurances at this link will go directly to a page that manages and outlines literally every one of these. So in a grant application, you will have a checkbox saying you agree to all of this. There's actually a link on the site we will show you called TEA Grant Opportunities that points to this. So these are referenced and incorporated in and are housed and live on a dynamic TEA page that is consistently updated for new guidance and provisions. So when we get into Q&A time, I may hop around to the to some of the pages here, but I want to point that out that you won't see all these pages in grant applications. You'll see them referenced, and they will point to these locations where these assurances, provisions, assurances, and guidelines are housed. The probably largest part of these requirements and assurances are general and fiscal guidelines on that second bullet. This is a tool that we use at TA that describes grant application procedures and general processes. So it's based on Edgar, but takes it a little bit further about kind of the operation of these and how these things are implemented at the sub-grantee level. Again, these apply to all grants that TEA administer. So again, we often ask the question, a good example, hey, this grant's not from Department of Education, does Edgar apply? When you apply for a TEA grant, it's incorporated because you're agreeing to all of these guidelines. So there can be things that do not apply specifically because a grant may not be from US Department of Education, but that's where does Edgar apply? The answer is yes. You're agreeing when you apply for these funds through an RFA and an application to follow these general and fiscal guidelines. Most of this information really reads towards the federal, but is also included in state grants in as much as it can and should apply. So two very important links there. The second bullet, general and fiscal guidelines, is kind of held to versioning control. So you'll notice, even there in the URL, when we do a revision and publish general and fiscal guidelines, it has an effective date. So the most recent ones will be for any grants that were posted on or after July 1st. So if you're operating an older, what we call an older grant at TEA, you will have the previous general and fiscal guidelines, which are part of that grant, still posted. And I believe we have about 4 or 5 versions. And you would just go to the applicable version based off the grant that is that you may be applying for. Too much text to read here, but I wanted to pull this piece out. This is that kind of initial information in any set of TEA grant program guidelines. It's often maybe second nature to folks that have applied to TEA grants before, but really want to point out, I've highlighted some keywords, some that we defined, but this statement really lays out the relationship when you apply for grants with TEA as a pass-through entity is the grantee. In general, it's U.S. Department of Education, but it could be another awarding agency. In some cases like DSHS or federal CDC. And then here's the relationship. TEA awards subgrants to non-federal entities. So the pass-through grantee award, TEA awards to the subgrantee non-federal entity, which could be an LEA, a school district, charter school, an education service center, and to a lesser degree, meaning not as often, not that they're lesser, IHEs, nonprofit organizations, and in this case, potentially private schools if you applied. Again, application to all subgrantees of TEA, regardless of how it's referenced. All of this applies for every grant. We may, here's that little caveat, we may use the terms grantee and subgrantee synonymously for subrecipients. So it is grantee to subgrantee, but keep in mind those terms can be used sometimes interchangeably. So this part of the request for applications, which will be the program guidelines, which is a PDF document launched with every grant, is used in conjunction with the general fiscal guidelines, schedule instructions, and then an application system. So we have several application systems. We use an e-grant system for our more longstanding formula federal grants. We have PDF paper, standard application system grants, and then in some cases, as is the case with the health support grant, we have online application systems. When someone is selected for funding, that is referenced in the notice of grant award or NOGA. So just want to spend a little bit of time there. This is the general structure of a set of grant program guidelines. These sections you will see when you access a grant. You go to TEA grant opportunities. Depending on questions, again, we'll navigate some of this, but every grant has a set of program guidelines. That is what you should read, review, and analyze first to determine if the grant is applicable, and then to see the requirements. So some things we pointed out, there is a name for a grant. Very important to have a name, especially if you receive the funds. Being general in naming the grant can greatly reduce the amount of time we can increase the amount of time it takes us to give you proper support. We have grants that are several cycles long, that may be year 1, year 3, year 5. So if a grantee needs assistance, says, hey, I need help with the COVID grant, it can be very difficult if you don't have the specific grant name. And this gets back to documentation as well. Identifying of a grant is important. Authorizing statute, contact information at the TEA level, funding and appropriation, whether it's federal, state, or some mixture. And then we have program purpose, goals, and objectives. This includes eligibility. Every grant has eligibility requirements. So it may be that only service centers can apply for a grant. It may be down the road that only private schools can apply for a grant, but there is an eligibility statement that would tell you specifically who is eligible to apply for a grant. We have some additional language that covers items that we will go into further detail at subsequent trainings on supplement, not supplant, administrative costs, and pre-award. And then we have that pyramid again, statutory requirements from federal, and then TEA program requirements from the state. So this is where things can become more requirement and slightly, if not more restrictive in these requirements. And these are spelled out in grant program guidelines. There's a section of allowable versus unallowable activities and uses of funds. This will probably be addressed pretty heavily at the 11 o'clock for the health and support grant. So we often get lots of questions. Can I do this? Is this allowable? Your first place to go is the grant program guidelines for that grant. In many cases, what is allowable and is not is clearly spelled out. And sometimes there is an allowable use of funds that says other allowable uses with pre-approval. So we know you have lots of questions, but I always urge you, if you are a recipient of federal funds, to go to the allowable and unallowable sections in the program guidelines to see if there are answers there. We also support recipients here by developing FAQs that may elaborate on some of these topics. Performance measures will also talk about things you must report. So there are reporting requirements we talked about earlier, but performance measures in a set of TEA program requirements will more clearly spell out things you need to, data and information you need to expect to collect and track on performance or financial. So it's a really good section. Again, if you're joining the 11 o'clock training for the health and safety support grant, you will become more familiar with these guidelines and where this information is, but it typically follows this structure. So you can, as you become more accustomed, find information in a set of program guidelines through the grant opportunities page. And this all, again, becomes part of your documentation. This is part of the federal award if you're a recipient. There are additional federal requirements that we address: equitable access and participation. Certain grants require private nonprofit school participation and maintenance of effort. And then sometimes grants have required attachments. So that is just kind of the bones or the framework of a grant program guidelines. And this is a hyperlink to the grant opportunities, which is essentially TEA's catalog of grant opportunities. It posts opportunities that you can apply to if you're eligible, but it also maintains grants, I think all the way back with the 7-year retention, I think all the way back to 2014. So if you have an older grant where you have to find information, those grant postings are retained there. Some other things that are incorporated in applications, I won't go into too much detail, but you would see at the guidelines, provisions, and assurances page is we have general provisions required by every TEA grant, again, separated by date for award on or after with some hyperlinks there. Debarment, suspension, lobbying certification are required for all grants, regardless of dollar amount. Lobbying is required for all grants greater than 100,000. So those links take you to specific requirements as a federal subrecipient. And then sometimes, depending on the grant, there is applicability of some other federal requirements going back to No Child Left Behind in some of our pre-existing grants, or the Every Student Succeeds Act. But those last two bullets, you would not necessarily see those as as requirements in a grant if not funded under those statutes. So a good example would be for a grant funded by CDC, where you see No Child Left Behind or Every Student Succeeds, there may be a reference to CDC or other authorizing statute. Again, all of this is built into grant applications. So you will see references and links in the guidelines and in the application for each grant. And that's part of the grant development process. It's 10 after, so I'm going to go over some specific considerations here. This is just going to be a bulleted list of areas we strongly encourage you to look at, consider, maybe even seek legal advice on if you're considering becoming a recipient of federal funds. We've covered most of this, but just want you to, these are kind of the weightier things, and this list is born out of our experience and discussion with other federal program managers at school districts and open enrollment charter schools. These are areas where we often see confusion or maybe even potential audit findings, but local policies and procedures, keeping these up to date is always important, and they are at the very foundation of maintaining compliance with federal awards. So if you have no local policies and procedures, or you do not know where to find those, that would be a very serious conversation to have before receiving federal funds. The state of your local policies and procedures. Documentation is always going to be important. And I don't know that there's ever a documentation that's enough, not to scare anyone, but we don't often say that's enough documentation at TEA. We will always guide you to fully document, because a grant award could be reviewed by any number of federal or state auditors or compliance personnel. And documentation is very important. So your ability and capacity to do those two, it's going to, I would say, probably directly impact your success as a federal grantee. Procurement is just a large topic. I encourage you again to sign up for those groups that I mentioned at the beginning to receive updates. We do lots of procurement trainings. We have videos of procurement already posted, a lot of resources. I urge you to kind of study and review procurement standards if considering receipt of federal funds. Time and effort, we have specific guidance there at the TA level, but it's one you definitely want to consider depending on how you keep track of time and effort and payroll at your institution. Allowability of cost is always an area of question and concern. I think we've laid out how you determine allowability, but it's something you want to consider when considering a grant if you're eligible, and then if the allowability of cost will meet your need. And then there's always monitoring and audit. So receiving the award, I would, in the past, I would have said is half the battle, is not necessarily half the battle. Receiving the grant award is just the start. There, again, to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse, there are many levels of monitoring and audit that you agree to comply with when you receive federal funds. Our audit team at TEA, we have what I would call a formula traditional audit unit, and then a specialized audit unit for disaster and stimulus grants. They provide trainings, they answer questions. They do their jobs to support good use of these funds and want to help schools in any way that they can. But they also have to monitor for compliance so that we're good stewards of these resources. So there are many other resources for monitoring and audit and subsequent trainings that you want to avail yourself to. And these are just areas we would really highlight that you want to focus on when you're considering becoming a recipient of federal funds. There probably should be another bullet there that just says forms. I probably couldn't list all the forms you may need to fill out, but there are forms to set up for receipt of funds. There are forms to receive a DUNS number, which is something else that is kind of in the weeds to discuss as well, but there are lots of forms to complete. Forms. I think anyone on this training would agree if you receive federal funds. Few resources. I think we're doing pretty good for questions. Thanks to Cory and Damon for answering some of those in the Q&A. Again, these are hyperlinks, so try to put these together where you can get back to them. This is just short of required reading, I would say. Not necessarily a great book with a cup of coffee, but these are very helpful resources. So we'll point to some of these. The TEA Grant Opportunities page lists all of our grant opportunities and all of the forms and steps to apply for those grants. It also links to and includes most, if not all, of the assurances, requirements, and things you agree to right from that page. After I scroll through, we'll kind of come back to this and go to these and try to show you some locations. General fiscal guidelines, this is the most current. There are several other versions, but I've linked it there. Provisions, guidelines, and assurances, that's the landing page for all of that. To fully comply with a lot of other requirements for prior approvals, TEA has a separate page for forms for prior approval, disclosure, and justification. Certain activities require TEA requires you to maintain a local form if you're doing it, like a field trip under a federal grant, whereas other forms require you to submit for prior approval, like a non-competitive procurement. So if there is any allowability or I don't want to say exemption, but any allowability for a certain activity, there may be a form that requires specific prior approval, and that's a page dedicated to those forms. Another good resource, we have a budgeting cost guidance handbook at that link that talks in more detail about some guidance on how to budget costs. Again, these were all developed for current federal grantees, which are local educational agencies or school districts and open enrollment charter schools, but this would be the same guidance handbook you can use as a private school where applicable. And then for procurement, our newest resource that I want to point out, if you have questions around procurement, would be this Procurement Guidance Handbook that was created by a brave soul named Virginia here at our department. So those are important resources to have and to become more familiar with. I want to point out one other resource. It's this is under the category of just in time. A lot of the information we have provided will be covered in this, but we are launching a new Back to Basics federal grant management training. We had sent this out, but it's actually our first. I think we're going to try to accomplish 2 of these before the holiday break. Will be tomorrow from 9 to 10:30 a.m. There is a registration link. I urge you not to panic. This is going to mostly focus on Edgar and some of the hierarchy. And this is really geared towards new, we had built it for new federal grant staff at LEAs and ESCs, but it can be for anyone that considers themselves new to or wants a refresher on federal grant management. So won't necessarily go into the same level of detail on the Code of Federal Regulations, but will be part 1 of a multi-part series to support all of our sub-grantees in the field. Again, tomorrow, 9 to 10:30, typically about an hour with time for questions, unless the presenter talks too much like me. Side note, I am the presenter, so that one will probably go a little bit longer too. You can register to attend, but with all of our trainings at TEA, especially in this department, if you do not attend the training, I urge you to still register. We use that list and send you everything after. If you are ever lost and know there's a recording of a training, we at the department post to this link in the middle of the page. That is our YouTube channel for grant compliance and administration, completely open to the public, training videos. I think we're pushing, we're probably well over 20 trainings recorded there. But by registering, we have your information, even if you cannot attend, to send you later slides and notice when the recording posts. So always good to register. It is not the end of the world if you can't attend. We know you're all busy. Our federal program staff and managers at school districts know you're often double and triple booked, but we record and provide all of this after the fact. We will open it to Q&A, and I will kind of stop there. We don't have any questions, so I'm going to be very brave and put my web browser up here and click through a couple of areas to show, but I'll give it a minute or two. Cory, Damon, I think we answered, you guys handled questions. Thank you for doing that. Cory, I didn't know if you, Cory may have left us. Damon, I didn't know if, since questions are cleared, if you had anything you wanted to add before I kind of hop through some of our resources and wait to see if questions pop up.
The only thing I'll add, and good morning to everyone again, is there was a question around, has the grant already posted? And yes, it has. It is live on the website. Matt, if you want to drop it in the chat, or I can, but it is live. The grant application is live. There's also a preview of the application, a PDF copy, and a website that I'll drop link to just all of the grant tools and resources. So I'll drop
Perfect.
that in a second.
Yeah, if you put that there, I will, I'll actually navigate to it. I like to go from the homepage so you can kind of see it. So, and I like to call names out. It makes us feel more personal, Brandy. This was answered. Is there, Damon answered that question. The health support grant that is being presented later today at 11 is available also to private schools. For LEAs, you want to go to that training for school districts also are eligible to apply. That is, I would say, a new and different grant from CDC where public and private schools are eligible. It's not a USDE grant, Brandy. So yes, I think we shared that training out. I'll show you where that is, but that training at 11, again, recorded if you can't attend, there is an avenue for school districts to apply as well as for private schools. So that's more about, it's one grant with eligibility for both. And I think Damon answered that question really well. Just want to say that for folks that are listening as well. I think we had some allowability question. I would encourage folks, if you had questions about purchasing of supplies, items for reimbursement, please attend the 11 o'clock or send that to COVID case report. I'm not trying to ignore you, but we're focused at this on the federal implications of receiving federal assistance. So allowability really needs to go to that 11 o'clock training or be sent. Part of what we talk about in allowability also has to do with the hierarchy. So we don't really want to address that here. Join us at 11 or be ready to view that later or send that question in. So I'm gonna go to two places here, Damon, if you'll keep an eye on questions. But for TA grants, we have a few places I want to point out, and then I will do that after showing what Damon mentioned. So this particular grant that we'll be talking about at 11 is, if you just go to TEA, I'm just going to navigate the way I do so that you can kind of follow along as you go to updates under emergency support and COVID. That little bug icon we've gotten so accustomed to. Most popular is here. I just go to public health orders and right here at the top, COVID-19 school health support grant, grants to schools. This page is really spearheaded by Damon. He's our, as he said, our program project manager lead who works and really leads this effort. So this is also the man with the plan behind COVID case report when you ask questions, who keeps us all in line there. So this is a link to this page. So the grant is posted live. Damon put it in the chat, and this is how it is posted. So for this particular grant, there's FAQ and guidance links with a red date showing how up to date they are. Here's where we are today, where you could have registered. If you still want to join us at 11 for the actual grant specifics, you can do that. Again, if you can't join at 11, I urge you to register. It will help ensure you receive the materials, or you can just come back and visit this page because we post recordings. There's an initial recording, and everything for this grant will post here. So this is specific to the school health support grant. You've got everything in the chat, direct linked, but just want to show you how to navigate to that. That's the area you want to stay in for the current grant. I mentioned in our training application and guidelines, there's the program guidelines. Will be covered later in more detail. There's the FAQ. We call that kind of non-regulatory guidance, but that's from the state level. There is the application. So anytime our general information references an application for this grant, the application is there. And then we finally got an accessible PDF for you to view. So all specific to that grant. Damon's going to take us through all of that, at the 11 o'clock training. I'm going to go back to my general resources. First things first, it's Thursday. We're almost through a week with the holidays. If this is too much and you kind of want to come back to it, I really strongly suggest you go to TEA and sign up for updates. So if you go here, I showed this, but I want to kind of type it in. There's my address, and I pretend I'm going to sign up and hit submit. These are all of the topics that would inundate your inbox if you signed up. And yes, I signed up for way too many. Feel the pain of that every day. But as a private school, we recently created, it's right here at the bottom under Texas schools, a private nonprofit school listserv. If I were you, even if you're not going to apply for this grant, I would click on that and subscribe to it. We often send out information specific to private schools there. We are tied into our good friend Laura at TEPSAC, and we can always add more. It is completely open for private nonprofit schools. Technically, anyone can join it if they're interested, but that is a listserv I would absolutely join. We have not sent more than a few emails out over the last 6 months. We try to keep it really specific to private schools. The other one for private schools that would be maybe nice to have is grants. This will alert you to grant opportunities. I can caution you now, a lot of this will not apply, and you could get lots of emails about federal formula grants, school district only grants, and a lot of other information you don't need or want. But this is the other listserv we manage where all of our announcements go out. I would, if I were attending, I would sign up for both, and then, just kind of based off your email tolerance, decide if you want to filter those or not. But I would definitely sign up for private school and urge you to sign up for grants potentially as well if you want to become more versed in this information. So that's the most important piece. If you walk away with nothing else, that will keep you connected. The other one I mentioned, TEA grant opportunities, kind of our catalog is right here at the top. So kind of seeing no open questions. I'm going to use the rest of this time to navigate. So you go to TEA grant opportunities. It is a great, albeit imperfect system for searching grants, listed by name, keyword search. There is currently no feature to search eligibility because that's not an easy filter to make. So there are not, I think I'll have to see, there are not any private school eligible grants on here at this time. I think we're getting the health and support grant posted here for consistency. I'm still checking to see if it is there, but I want to point out a few things that we already talked about. So at some point, we will have the this grant we're covering at 11 o'clock also posted here. A few things I want to point out. Link to the grants page with a lot of information, competitive grants, all of those guidelines, provisions, and assurances that I mentioned, link right there. And this is the page I was talking about. So everything that's in those slides on this page is there. So that's how it's incorporated. Forms for specific activities. This is worth noting. Any of these things require prior approval. Inventory we talked about. If you generate program income, non-competitive procurement. Again, if you're weighing into this world, I urge you to review and consider this, and we continue to develop trainings on these items. There's the budgeting cost guidance handbook. Some information about amending applications, which is general to these grants, not necessarily the health and support grant. And then we have a help desk. A good place to review a grant when you pull it up is you can search by a name and then hit the little view bar. So I will go to our nursing grant, and then you get a full listing of the grant. Description, eligibility, statutory authority, funding information with timeline. All of those things we mentioned. There's more links to those assurances and regulations. This is where we typically have a link to guidelines, an application, and a budget. Again, health and support grant will look completely different. I just want to show you this, and then timeline. So there's our friend Damon, and this is a nursing grant specific to Education Service Center. So this is what a grant listing looks like. And you can, anyone publicly can review any of these just to get more accustomed to them. So that's, this is really a must-have page if you're considering doing this. So I don't know that there's many more resources I haven't already covered.